For the past 3 years, Ludus has reigned as the 66th emperor of the empire, even though ascending to the throne was never his intention. Prior to this, his father and older brother had ruled the empire for 15 years. But monster invasions and rampant corruption, it claimed their lives on the battlefield, leaving the throne to Ludus. He was completely unfamiliar with politics and the country's affairs. Initially, the royal court intended to turn him into a puppet. But Ludus proved them wrong. He led the empire to many glorious victories, conquering great milestones. However, one day, the princes who hated Ludus spread false rumors, which quickly reached the ears of the people, causing them to turn against him. They gave him the nickname the Devil in human form. In this situation, the monsters loyal to Ludus are ready to protect him. He declared that humankind were fools for daring to point a sword at Master Ludus. The reason people called Ludus the Devil in human form, it was the imperial mark that he bore, a special mark reserved only for royalty. It allows the owner to control humans, dragons, and sacred mythical creatures. However, the entire royal court feared Ludus, especially because his imperial mark allowed him to control monsters. This fear was so great that Ludus was confined to the Academy of Magic, but this turned out to be an advantage for him. The longer he stayed there, the stronger his magic became, to the point where even high-level spells were no longer a challenge. Nevertheless, despite Ludus's many good deeds for the empire, the discrimination stemming from his title of the Devil in human form remained, even after he became emperor. Returning to the story, Ludus's monstrous minions are eager to fight against humanity to protect him. But Ludus considered them fools, because he knew that such an action would only lead to war. The emperor's mark bestowed upon him absolute power. But when his subordinates disagreed, he was forced to use it to compel their obedience. To activate the mark, Ludus needs to say out her full name. But he forgot his name before he could say it, which made his subordinates breathe a sigh of relief. But Rune, a slime subordinate, mentioned Ludus's name. This angered the other subordinates because they didn't want Ludus to use the mark on them. When the mark is activated, Ludus ordered his subordinates to retreat to the mountains, and as soon as they obeyed, the master-servant relationship between them would end. Then Ludus sat silently on the throne, a single tear rolling down her cheek. The people finally swarmed into the palace. One of them grabbed Ludus by the collar. They loudly accused him of plundering their taxes to enrich himself, while they suffered poverty and hardship. Ludus remained calm in the situation, telling the man that the accusations were untrue. To further convince him, he confidently told the man he was free to search the palace for treasure, as Ludus knew perfectly well that there was no treasure there at all. This man had lost his wife in a war 8 years ago during the reign of Ludus's brother, but he was completely unaware of it. He blamed Ludus for everything, believing that he was the one responsible for his wife's death. Ludus realized that he couldn't stop his father's rage, so he calmly said, "If killing him would bring him relief, then go ahead, because he understands his guilt." Without hesitation, the man drew his dagger and stabbed Ludus to death. In her final moments, Ludus realized that her life had actually been quite dull. If there is an afterlife, he hopes to live a freer life. The scene shifts to a small house in the suburbs, where Ludus woke up in the form of a newborn baby. He soon realized he had been reborn. The words of the monks about reincarnation, which he had previously disbelieved, now became the only plausible explanation. Ludus was born into a poor farming family, and coincidentally, the name Ludus from his previous life was also a very common name in this village. Over time, he gradually became familiar with the language of this land, but it was certainly not one of the languages he knew. Ludus was eager to learn more about this new world. So initially, he hoped to find some books to read. However, he quickly realized that the villagers here were illiterate. Just then, a villager hurriedly raised the alarm. The announcement stated that the village chief had just collapsed. Everyone immediately rushed to his room to inquire about the situation. Ludus used his situational analysis skills and discovered that the village chief only had a common cold. This made him wonder why they didn't use basic healing techniques to treat him. Unable to abandon the village chief, Ludus stepped forward, placed her hand on his chest, and used healing magic to bring down his fever. Witnessing this, the villagers were astonished and praised Ludus, as they never expected him to be able to use magic. It was then that Ludus realized why they were so impressive. That's because nobody in this village knows how to use magic. Looking back, he realized he had never seen them perform any magic. Even the simplest spells were incomprehensible. This made Ludus wonder if illiteracy would prevent them from learning magic. From that day on, Ludus began using her magic to do good, helping people. Thanks to this, he gradually regained his magical abilities. Over time, Ludus discovers that he can use most of the magic he learned in his previous life. However, he also needed to be careful because the amount of magical power in his body was currently only average. But this wasn't a big problem, because Ludus knew that she could increase her magical power through training and practice. Curious about the time that has passed since my death? Ludus decided to visit the village chief, express their intention to leave this small village. The main reason was that he wanted to learn more about this new world by traveling and exploring. In his previous life, Ludus never had the freedom to explore as he wished. But in this new life, he is no longer bound by the shackles of duty. The village chief, while understanding Ludus's wishes, could not let him leave so easily. He offered two options. The first option is to become a soldier serving a lord, and secondly, to become an explorer. The prospect of becoming an explorer immediately sparked Ludus's interest. The village chief explained that being an adventurer meant he would still work under the lord, but would get to fight monsters, and the freedom to travel the world in the process, although both options are very dangerous. Without hesitation, Ludus quickly decided that she wanted to become an adventurer. The next day, he told his parents about his decision. Initially, they strongly opposed it, out of concern for his safety, but after Ludus's persistent pleading, they finally relented, allowing him to pursue his chosen path. That day also marked the moment Ludus officially became an adult. A few days later, Ludus prepared to leave the village to go to the nearest adventurers' guild. The young man's parents saw him off, warning him not to be reckless and risk his life. Ludus set off, breathing a sigh of relief, because now he is free to do whatever he wants. He decided to head straight to the city of Elpin, where the Explorers Guild was located. Before becoming a full-fledged explorer, Ludus needs to pass the council's test. Upon arriving, he looked around and realized that the weapons here were very similar to those he had seen in the old empire. However, the biggest problem Ludus faced at this moment was that he still couldn't read. While he was lost in thought, a receptionist at the club noticed him and asked if he would like to register as a member of the Adventurers Club. Ludus nodded in confirmation, and the employee explained that to become an adventurer, he needed to prove his ability to defeat the monster. Specifically, Ludus will have to carry a body part or weapon of a monster as proof. If the item is deemed valid, Ludus will officially become a member of the guild. Ludus thought the requirements for joining the Explorers Guild seemed quite easy, since if he wanted to, he only needed one of those items from the nearest market. However, he decided to choose the path of honesty. So let's begin our journey into the forest to search for the monster. As she ventured deeper into the forest, Ludus realized that the relationship between humans and monsters remained unchanged. Monsters kill humans, and humans kill monsters. In the past, Ludus only killed monsters when there was no other option. Now, as he continued to search the forest, he suddenly remembered that if his subordinates from his previous life were still with him, he could use their detection skills to find the monster. But since they were no longer there, Ludus had to rely on his eyesight, which made the search take longer than expected. Passing by a gloomy cave, Ludus sensed a faint, weak surge of magic emanating from within. Curious, he went inside and was quite disappointed when they discovered it was just a few green slimes writhing in the corner of the cave. Upon realizing that these slimes understood human language, Ludus thought she could negotiate with them. However, before the agreement could begin, Ludus was suddenly shocked when asked why slimes could speak the language of the Empire. One slime showed annoyance at the question, then proudly declared that it was a loyal servant of Master Ludus. Upon hearing this, Ludus immediately became certain that this slime was Rune, one of his loyal monster subordinates from a previous life. Rune began to panic, asking how Ludus knew that name. Ludus tries to convince Rune that she is her former owner. It's simply that I've been reborn in a new body. Rune didn't believe it, so Ludus used her projection skill to directly transfer his memories into Rune's mind. When she realized Ludus was actually her former owner, Rune immediately jumped into his arms, expressing her joy and the intense longing she felt after centuries of separation. After a conversation aimed at rekindling their old connection, Ludus learned that approximately 1,000 years had passed since his death. Rune recounted that after Ludus's death, the other monsters traveled through the mountains and held a meeting to decide on their next move. However, they were unable to reach an agreement. So they eventually parted ways, each going their separate ways. Since then, Rune has chosen to avoid humanity and live in seclusion to survive, while also gathering more allies. This explains why it's here in the form of a slime. Ludus also understands that slimes are immortal unless directly attacked, which explains why Rune has been able to survive for millennia. After clearing up all misunderstandings, Rune realized Ludus was trying to prove her monster hunting abilities. So she suggested that Ludus provide a part of her body as proof. Since slime bodies have the ability to regenerate very quickly, even so, Ludus carefully used healing spells on Rune to speed up the regeneration process. When it was time to return to the Explorers Guild, Ludus packed her bags and said goodbye. But before he left, Rune called after him. Ludus asked her to make her his subordinate once more. The offer left Ludus speechless because he hadn't expected this at all. Although feeling guilty for abandoning Rune and the other subordinates, Ludus was still worried about her current situation. He was just a humble farmer who lost everything, including the imperial seal. Ludus held out her palm as proof, showing Rune that the Emperor's mark had disappeared. But surprisingly, the mark was still there, clearly visible on his hand. Ludus didn't think this was just a coincidence. He saw it as a reminder that he needed to atone for his past mistakes and correct them. With that in mind, Ludus decided to make a contract with Rune. He officially made her his subordinate once again. However, on the way back to the Explorers Guild, Ludus began to worry about bringing Rune along. Because if you're caught carrying a slime, it will attract unwanted attention. Rune understood the situation and immediately transformed, turning into a beautiful young woman. Ludus was astonished to realize that this figure was exactly like Cecile, a former classmate of his from the academy in a previous life. Rune accomplished this by using his special skill, disguise, which helps conceal the form of a creature or object. This skill only lasted for a short time, but Rune mastered it to near perfection. She copied Cecile's appearance so accurately that it was indistinguishable from the real person. Cecile is the daughter of the Grand Duke, whom Ludus secretly loves. But now she is no longer alive, and Ludus felt uncomfortable that Rune had copied her body again. Rune sensed Ludus's unease and immediately apologized, explaining that it was much easier to replicate the appearance of someone who had died 1,000 years ago. After explaining, Rune said it was time for them to leave, but addressed Ludus as Master. Ludus corrected him, telling Rune to just call him by his name. As they set off, Rune questioned Ludus's decision to become an adventurer, as it seemed quite unexpected. Ludus explained that it was his only choice, as he wanted the freedom to travel the world. However, Ludus worried about the possibility of encountering his monster minions, who were still alive. Especially since he wasn't sure if they would forgive him for abandoning them, Rune comforted Ludus, telling her not to worry about it, because she wouldn't forgive anyone who didn't understand Ludus's reasons. Ludus appreciated Rune's sympathy, but he knew things wouldn't be that simple. Moving forward, he saw a carriage with a broken wheel being attacked by goblins. Observed more closely, Ludus realized that the soldiers were no longer strong enough to fight off the goblins. And if things continue like this, they won't be able to last much longer. Therefore, Ludus decided to wipe out all the goblins. Although he didn't want to draw too much attention to himself, This was an unavoidable situation, and he couldn't ignore it. The strategist targeted the unarmored goblins first, then used Thunder Whip to attack the goblins who are using bows and arrows. The goblins showed no sign of giving up. Therefore, Ludus was forced to burn their leader to death. This terrified the remaining goblins and began to flee. When they were ordered to retreat, Ludus realized they were speaking the language of the Empire. This made him wonder how they could have survived until now. Initially, he thought about chasing after them. But then, remembering he was just a novice explorer, he decided to let them go. Meanwhile, the soldiers drew the attention of all the surrounding adventurers as the princess had lost consciousness. Ludus approached the princess. He used his magic to diagnose her condition and realized that she had been afflicted with a poisonous curse. Upon hearing this, the soldiers immediately panicked. Ludus realized that this was a very dangerous situation because if we don't act quickly, the princess will die within 5 minutes. The carriage broke down. That means there's no way to save the girl. The only option was for Ludus to use purification, a highly advanced medical technique that is very difficult to master. He knew this might attract attention, but he couldn't let the girl die, so he had no other choice. He asked everyone to step back, as he was about to use a temporary first aid spell to save her. Ludus completed her treatment, and the soldiers were relieved to see her beginning to regain consciousness. However, this was only temporary first aid, so Ludus urgently requested the knights to take her to a doctor immediately. Ludus realized she had made a smart decision, as this action wouldn't draw his attention to her, now that the treatment was almost complete. The knights were extremely grateful and appreciative, making Ludus sweat as he instructed them not to pay too much attention to him. However, the princess's condition continued to worsen. Therefore, Ludus suggested they take her back to the city for prompt medical attention. After rescuing the princess and ensuring she received adequate medical care, Ludus secretly left, believing she would be all right. As they prepared to return to the expedition, he was stopped by Rune, who apologized for making Ludus wait so long. Ludus informs Rune that he plans to join the expedition, and now that she has a human form, she can join as well. Upon arriving at the expedition, they discovered that to register, they needed a letter of recommendation from the village chief. Rune realized they lacked the necessary documents, so she suggested they just fake it. They thought no one would find out. With that idea in mind, they approached the reception desk, presented the slime body part, and 2 fake letters of introduction. When the receptionist checked the letters, Rune and Ludus were understandably worried, fearing that she would discover the deception. However, when the receptionist reached into her pocket and saw a green slime, she was surprised because this type of slime is extremely rare. Ludus breathed a sigh of relief when the receptionist approved her and presented them with official explorer badges. With their joining the expedition guild complete, Ludus and Rune officially became explorers of the guild. Then, the expedition guide explained the duties and rights of an explorer. First, explorers can use any of the guild's facilities across the continent, which suits Ludus perfectly as it's something he's always wanted. At the same time, they also have a duty to eliminate the monsters, but Ludus thinks this shouldn't be too difficult to accomplish. Finally, the expedition had a hierarchical system. The title of each explorer is determined. If an explorer meets the criteria of the guild, they will be called by titles such as warrior, hunter, or mage. Ludus and Rune will be taking an exam to determine their rank. Ludus returned home, lying in bed, feeling tired. He wasn't doing anything too strenuous, but perhaps it was because he hadn't fought in 15 years. He decided to go to bed early today. At that moment, Rune jumped onto Ludus, asking him for a massage, while submerging him in a watermelon. This surprised Ludus, and he yelled at her to get down immediately. Rune with teary eyes. She returned to her slime form and said she felt ashamed of her actions. Seeing her sad expression, Ludus realized he had been a little harsh, so he apologized to her. Meanwhile, he suddenly realized it had been over 1,000 years since they last met, and Rune was probably too emotional about it. Ludus knelt down, caressed her, and reminded her how happy he was to see her again. This brightened Rune's mood. That evening, they both talked about the upcoming exams. Ludus asked Rune to restrain his power, using only basic skills to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. As for himself, he was no longer as strong as before, so he had no difficulty adapting to his new life. However, he realized one thing: limiting his power was difficult. Using magic in real battle is easier, because he can freely display his power. But trying not to attract attention wasn't easy at all. Even if he wanted to join the mage class, he still had to avoid using advanced magic. Ludus asked Rune which class she was aiming for, and she replied that it was the warrior class, because she preferred close combat fighting and wasn't good at magic. Nevertheless, Ludus decided to buy her a suit of armor and weapons so she could fight better. Although it would cost quite a bit of money, but since they're going to become adventurers, getting that money back won't be too difficult. Ludus enjoyed this moment because he could finally do what he wanted. Then they promised not to back down. We are committed to conquering new challenges together. However, Ludus still had a lot to think about. Their main goal was to earn money and buy a place to live. Then he will take the time to find his subordinates again. The next morning, they went to the Explorers Guild. They were introduced to Noor, who was in charge of ranking them in their aptitude test. Noor congratulated them on becoming official adventurers and announced that it was time to begin the test. She asked Ludus to go first. I asked him if he could use magic. Ludus replied reluctantly, implying that he lacked confidence in his magical abilities. He tried not to attract attention, so he decided to use only basic magic and minimize their power as much as possible. The first test involved healing techniques. Therefore, Noor asked Ludus to restore her magical energy using a basic healing technique. This wasn't difficult for Ludus, as the required magic was extremely basic. Ludus performed magic, but Noor's eyes widened in surprise when he saw that the man had used magic without a spell. Ludus, bewildered by Noor's reaction, looked at her and explained that he knew nothing about it, as he was just an ordinary farmer. Mages of the old empire could cast spells without incantations, but now only descendants of the empire can do so. This led Noor to believe that Ludus was a descendant of the empire, and from that, she became convinced that Ludus was qualified to become a mage. Meanwhile, Ludus bowed her head, realizing that differences in the use of magic had begun to become apparent. The next round is about offensive magic. Ludus couldn't afford to reveal any further suspicion, so he told Noor that he would only use one basic attack, a fireball. Realizing that this spell was too simple, Ludus just needs to adjust her magical power. He manipulated magic and used it to destroy his targets without attracting attention. Noor intended to extinguish the fire using his hydro-based techniques to put it out, but surprisingly, the fire didn't go out. Ludus looked back, surprised, realizing that the fireball he had just conjured was an upgraded version used by the military, meaning only a large amount of magic could extinguish it. Ludus thought to himself that Noor must be incredibly strong to withstand this magic. He wondered if anyone was powerful enough to extinguish his fireball. In a moment of panic, Noor realized it would be embarrassing if he couldn't put out the fire. She decided to try one more time, using her water-based techniques, hoping to extinguish the fire. Ludus, realizing her power was still insufficient, he then used his magic to enhance her power. Before the magic could be cast, everything happened so quickly, and Noor was surprised that the fire was finally extinguished. At the end of the test, Noor realized she was too tired to put out the fire immediately. Based on the test results, she concluded that Ludus's abilities qualified her to become a witch apprentice, and it even promoted him to a higher rank, making him an official wizard. Ludus heard this, bowed his head, and thanked her deeply. I breathed a sigh of relief because everything had gone smoothly. Now it's Rune's turn to check. Throughout the test, Rune used spells and reduced his magical power to its lowest level. She completed the exam with flying colors, become a member of the guild, and receive the rank of apprentice warrior. The next day, the two began their new lives as adventurers. They headed to the bulletin board, eager to find a quest, but all I saw were tedious tasks like fighting goblins. Just then, Eris a hunter called them over. asking if they were new recruits. After the introduction, Eris told Ludus that she didn't sense any intimidating aura from him, despite rumors that he had been promoted to wizard. At this point, Eris was slightly surprised by Ludus's request, as there were many goblins around here. Goblins often attack human cities and hide in forests, making them even more difficult to find since they establish bases deep within the woods. Ludus listened to the explanation and realized that goblin attacks on major cities were the reason many quests involve fighting goblins. But not many hunters accepted the offer, because the reward from the feudal lords was too low. A dell was only equivalent to a full glass of beer, and each goblin killed would only yield the hunter 1 dell, a paltry sum, making the quest almost worthless. Nevertheless, Ludus decided to accept the mission to fight the goblins, because he had a vague feeling upon hearing that the goblins here could speak the language of the Empire. He suspected this might be the work of one of his former subordinates, and he wanted to find out more. So, Ludus officially received her first mission, fighting goblins, along with Rune. Ludus and Rune begin their first mission as hunters, heading north to Elpin to engage in battle with goblins. As they walked, Rune playfully asked Ludus what she thought of her armor. Ludus blushed and replied that it was just a breastplate, so she shouldn't expect too much. This breastplate is old, has been used by the military, and is no longer in service. But strangely enough, when Rune wore it, it looked elegant and dignified in Ludus's eyes. Ignoring that, Ludus asked Rune if she knew anything about goblins being able to speak the language of the Empire. Goblins speaking the Imperial language weren't uncommon, but Rune suspected they were descendants of the Empire. There are also goblins among Ludus's subordinates, and if they are present here, Ludus can order them to leave Elpin. However, the major problem is that goblins view humans as food, forcing them to resort to violence. Soon after, the goblins appeared, staring at them with eyes full of hatred. Ludus didn't want to fight, he only wanted to negotiate. So he asked them to call their leader. However, the goblins were unwilling to negotiate because they were showing disrespect to Ludus. To protect his master, Rune had no choice but to annihilate the first wave of goblin attacks. This terrified the remaining goblins. Ludus wanted to keep the goblins alive for questioning, but he accidentally killed them. Realizing his actual fighting skills were terrible, Ludus tried to communicate with the remaining goblin, but it refused to negotiate. So Rune stabbed it through the chest. She warned it never to harm its owner. This bloody battle made Ludus realize that negotiation was impossible unless he could speak to their leader. After thanking Rune for protecting him, she blushed and said that she liked receiving compliments from her master. Before leaving, one of the goblins whispered its last breath. "Save him, Master Bates." The next day, they returned to guild adventurers. They were planning to claim their reward for the 50 goblins they had brought back. When they arrived at the reception desk, the receptionist was astonished to see that they had defeated so many goblins. He shouted in utter astonishment. Ludus had killed that many goblins, but that was the only information he had. That's the name of Bates, the supreme leader of the goblins. Bates was once one of his subordinates, who had sworn allegiance to him out of a burning desire to study magic. Logically, Bates should have died long ago. However, Ludus realized that perhaps a life-extending magic had been developed. Although Bates may command attacks against others, he wouldn't kill someone without a justifiable reason. It's also possible they're just coincidental names. While Ludus was lost in thought, Eris, a colleague, approached and congratulated them on their first assignment. She had heard many stories about new recruits, but had never seen anyone do something so impressive. Brought back 50 goblin eyes. Eris remembered the first time she only caught 3 goblins. This made her realize the superior power of Ludus and Rune. Ludus sensed that this situation was not good, as all the attention was focused on her. People started asking him for advice on how he managed to do it, and he explained that it was like hunting wild boars, lure them into a trap and then kill them. Eris didn't believe it, because she knew goblins weren't that stupid. Ludus forced a smile, trying to convince Eris, then explained that Rune had acted as bait, making the plan more convincing. At this point, Ashura, another explorer, stood up and began to boast. It is said that in his first mission, he was called Great Ashura, who slayed goblins for the people. However, Eris knew Ashura's history well, so she didn't hesitate to expose the truth, saying that he was so weak he couldn't even defeat a goblin and had to return to seek help. Putting that aside, everyone decided to throw a party to celebrate the success of Ludus and Rune's first mission. Suddenly, Eris crept closer to Rune and grabbed her watermelon, and told her to eat more so they could grow even bigger. After completing their first task, they continued the party with laughter, drinks, and delicious food. Having become true adventurers, they participate in the Goblin Skirmish mission alongside their seniors, Eris and Castle. Both Eris and Castle prove their strength, defeating a wave of goblins without the help of Ludus and Rune. Ludus didn't participate in this mission because of the reward. Instead, it was to observe Nor's magical power. Nor has reached the highest rank of adventurers, and Ludus hopes to learn more about her magic. Over time, Ludus realized that the level of magic in this era had declined considerably. None of them, including Nor, could use intermediate magic, let alone advanced magic. However, Nor is capable of using a wide range of spells, leading Ludus to believe she has untapped potential. Eris realized that Ludus had been staring at Nor for a while now, convincing herself that he had feelings for Nor. Upon arriving at the next city, Kaisel and Eris announced that they had business to attend to and told Ludus and Nor to return to ILD after some time. Before leaving, Eris waved goodbye to them, then winked at Ludus, saying she would create a private room for them to study in. Ludus stood there dumbfounded, feeling confused, realizing there might have been some misunderstanding. Ludus and Nor strolled around the city, and he realized this was a good opportunity to ask her about the secrets to improving his magical skills, but he didn't know where to begin. They happened to pass by a giant statue that Ludus found very familiar. He discovered that he and the statue shared the same name, but thought it was just a coincidence. Nor explained the history of the statue, making Ludus realize that it was erected to commemorate his former emperor. Legend says he mastered all kinds of magic, won every battle, and destroyed evil forces. However, Ludus knew that this story was quite far from the truth. Nor shared that the person who built the statue is rumored to be the emperor's assassin. Ludus, his face glistening with sweat, couldn't believe it because the person who had killed him hated him to the core. Surprisingly, Ludus discovered that 500 years after his death, all of his actions as emperor were justified. Therefore, a statue was erected to commemorate him. After the collapse of the empire, the world was devastated. Therefore, people began to worship the statue, turning Ludus into a famous god in the present world. They prayed for the return of the Holy Emperor. And the statue was a symbol of that. Still in a state of shock, Ludus realized that no matter how dilapidated the world might be, all they desired was the restoration of humanity. That evening, Ludus returned home to meet Rune, who is excited about his master's return. With their combined income, they rented a room long-term. They also summoned some more tiny slimes from the cave with Rune's help. These slimes have mastered the basics, and they might even use camouflage techniques to transform themselves into humans for a day. Their presence has been a great help to Ludus, as his strength and magic have been enhanced since their arrival. When slimes have the ability to camouflage themselves, Ludus wanted them to try it right away, but he didn't know who to transform into. Disguising himself as anyone around him was a terrible idea, so he decided to take the form of someone he knew from a previous life. Rune suggested that they could transform into Celine, his blue-haired classmate from a past life. Then a slime transformed into Selene, much to Ludus's surprise. And he realized he had to name this slime girl. After a moment of thought, he decided to call her Marina, a beautiful girl with hair as blue as clear water. Meanwhile, Ludus knew that Rune understood him well. But what he didn't understand was why she cared so much about romantic relationships. Marina is very honored to receive the name from Ludus. Rune suggested they do the same with the remaining slimes. Although the accuracy might not be as high, at that moment, Eris burst into their room, demanding they come to the guild immediately. Along the way, Ludus noticed that Eris seemed unusual, as she didn't look like herself. Upon arriving at the guild, they found the guildmaster making an announcement that the Beijing Towers reported seeing an army of goblins moving toward Elpen. This announcement helped Ludus realize that the goblins in the forest were actually just pawns. The guildmaster suggested everyone prepare for a goblin raid outside the city. A preemptive strike aimed at halting their advance. Adventurers will participate directly on the front lines and are required to be well prepared. Ludus wondered what the Grand Duke was thinking, as this strategy was completely illogical. Even though goblins were enemies, organizing such an attack was reckless. The Grand Duke ordered that while preparations for the preemptive strike were underway, the adventurers would be responsible for defending the city walls. But they paid little attention to defensive walls and focused solely on launching a preemptive attack, making Ludus realize they were being overly confident in this strategy. 1,000 goblins faced 600 soldiers from Elpen. On the day of the raid, the army's formation was quickly broken as the cavalry advanced too far, while the goblins held their ground despite their limited abilities. Ludus and Rune observed from a distance, realizing that the situation could become very bad if it continued like this. The reason the cavalry advanced so far was because they greatly underestimated the goblins. In a one-on-one fight, it might be possible to overwhelm the goblins, but with their current disorganized formation, dealing with their counterattack will be extremely difficult. Ludus looked around and was surprised to see the princess he had rescued before was present. Putting that aside, he noticed the goblins' formation. It was the tactical formation of the old empire. With this formation, they could attack directly into the center of the enemy's ranks. Furthermore, the cavalry had advanced too far and couldn't return to provide support, making the situation even more perilous. Seeing the goblins moving in perfect unison and with such precision, Ludus had no doubt. This was definitely the Empire's tactic. He knew this battle was about to become extremely fierce. Meanwhile, the Queen questioned the soldiers about the commander's position. When they learned that he was in a brothel instead of on the battlefield, the princess was extremely angry and ordered the soldiers to take her there immediately. Ludus observed the princess's firm and confident demeanor and understood that she was not someone to be underestimated. Shortly afterward, the battle officially began. Unexpectedly, the enemy's formation collapsed. This left Ludus bewildered, wondering if his initial judgments were wrong. If things continued as they were, his forces could very well win. However, this made Ludus reconsider the name Bates that the goblins had mentioned. Perhaps it wasn't someone he knew, because if it were, things would have unfolded completely differently. Suddenly, a sharp gust of wind swept through, startling and panicking the soldiers. Nor collapsed, his eyes filled with despair, muttering that this was the end. Eris tried to calm her, but Nor continued her panic, saying that the wind was a sign of a legendary spell, the Firestorm. A destructive spell capable of wiping out thousands of soldiers in the blink of an eye. Upon hearing this, Ludus immediately realized that this wind was a type of high-level magic that had existed in his era. Back then, only mages with immense magical power could use this kind of magic, but now it had reappeared, demonstrating its extraordinary, terrifying, and dangerous nature. Not wanting to let fear spread within the team, Ludus quickly cast the tranquility spell on Nor. This lulled her to sleep. He bowed his head in apology, saying he couldn't let her panic affect the morale of the others. Then, Ludus ordered Roan to summon all the slimes because the time for battle had come. When he sliced a goblin in half, Ludus realized that the front line had long since collapsed. Saving the entire army was almost impossible. The only remaining option was to attack the enemy base directly. The aim was to disrupt their formation. Ludus knew there were only two types of magic suitable for this strategy without being detected. Stealth magic, completely concealing sound and the source of magical energy. Invisibility magic, only concealing the presence of the caster. However, the invisibility spell consumes too much magic power. making it impossible to use simultaneously with the invisibility spell. Therefore, Ludus decided that Rune and the slimes would disguise themselves in cloaks. He calculated that with this strategy, they could approach the enemy base without being detected. However, their magical energy was depleted very quickly during their journey. Ludus was certain that all of this was part of Bates's plan, who seemed to have anticipated their every move. Upon arriving at the goblin base, Ludus successfully approached their leader and frankly requested a conversation. Not wanting to waste time, Ludus declared that he was the emperor whom Bates had once served. But Bates didn't believe him and ordered his men to attack Ludus. Cornered with no other option, Ludus used lightning, unleashing a thunderous attack that annihilated all of Bates's subordinates in an instant. Bates stood stunned, observing the situation. However, Ludus was even more astonished to realize that they were completely unaware of the attack he had just used. This made him realize that this wasn't the Bates he knew 1,000 years ago. After some conversation, Ludus discovered that the leader of these goblins was the 18th Bates, and all the goblins here are descendants of the original Bates. One of them will bear the title of Bates. This explains why they can speak the language of the Empire. Ludus concluded that they had learned the firestorm technique from the original Bates. However, they were astonished as to how he knew about it in the first place. Their high-level magic was actually only average compared to Ludus, so he told them to keep training so that one day they could use higher-level magic. However, Bates didn't believe he could ever master high-level magic, even if he dedicated his entire life to it. He thought he couldn't achieve it right now. But perhaps in 1,000 years, the next generation would be able to. Ludus heard this. He immediately burst into loud laughter. He believed Bates could do it, so he proposed a deal. If Bates ended the war and became his subordinate, Ludus will teach him advanced magic and share all of their knowledge. This offended Bates, and he ordered his men to kill Ludus. But as expected, Bates's henchmen were no match for Ludus. Ludus realized that Bates was now much weaker than before, as he didn't even know about reflection magic. After killing Bates, Rune informs Ludus that the fire he started is spreading. At this point, he uses a high-level spell, water spray, to extinguish the flames. Nor witnessed this scene and realized that this was high-level magic. This made her think that Emperor Ludus had returned. With the goblins defeated, Ludus decided to return. Goblins naturally harbor a deep-seated hatred for humans, and humankind is no different, because for thousands of years, humans have been exterminating goblins. But before leaving, Ludus witnessed one of the remaining goblins bow before him, swearing allegiance. He said he wanted to become Ludus's subordinate and learn magic after defeating Bates. The goblin's formation quickly collapsed. Ludus accepted the goblin's request, using the invisibility and concealment spells to return to Elpin. Upon returning to the guild, everyone celebrated the victory. Let Ludus drink as much as she wants. However, people began to notice that Nor was missing. They speculated that she might be in the town square, seeking some fresh air. Nor was still in shock after witnessing the enemy's magic, so they decided to wait for her until she calmed down. However, Castle believes this is something much deeper than that. She seemed afraid of something, as if it reminded her of something. Upon reflection, they realized something strange. The magic the goblins had used had vanished without a trace. Some priests even claimed that the forbidden magic was divine judgment. Rune was drunk at the time, and she revealed Ludus's true potential. But no one believed her because of her intoxicated state. Ludus calmly comforted her and helped her to bed, confident she would be all right because he knew she had drunk a lot of water. Marina came up behind him and said he should rest a little after everything he had done. Then he apologized to Bates for what happened. Although he had become Ludus's subordinate and promised to persuade the other goblins to obey, but there's still one problem: accommodation. Rune and Marina could stay in this room, while Ludus and the other goblins would stay in another, but the need for accommodation increased as the number of subordinates grew. Goblins cannot live in nearby urban and rural areas, so building a remote dwelling is crucial. Seeing how tired Ludus was, Marina suggested he rest for a day and continue the next day. he lay down to rest next to Rune, who had fallen asleep some time ago. A moment later, Rune woke up to find her clothes were gone. Ludus's chest was pressed against her body, giving her a feeling of warmth and softness. After a while, Ludus regained her composure and ordered Rune to put his clothes back on immediately. Just then, a group of guards burst into the room, demanding that Ludus follow them. Rune thought Ludus had been kidnapped, immediately jumped out of bed, and attacked them. Ludus reassured her that he hadn't done anything wrong and was just conducting an interrogation. He told her not to worry and then followed them to see what they wanted. Ludus arrived at a magnificent palace where he met Roston. The princess's guardian said that he had a hard time finding Ludus because he had left without revealing his name. The princess had summoned him, and so he respected the invitation and entered her room. When Ludus arrived, he observed the princess and realized she was so beautiful that even the princesses and nobles of the empire could hardly compare. After Ludus greeted the princess, she bluntly asked him how he had treated her earlier, her expression serious. Ludus guessed that she would call him over for this reason. He thought she must be very knowledgeable about magic, so she would be able to tell if he was lying. He considered altering her memories, but with his current magical abilities, he couldn't do that. Therefore, his only option was to deceive her. He said it was a kind of inherited magic in his village that could cure many kinds of poisons. Surprisingly, she believed this explanation and said that was exactly what she'd expected. When she was poisoned, the princess tried an antidote, but it didn't work, and she subsequently fainted. Knowing that this type of poison could only be neutralized by the skill Ludus had mentioned, purge. Ludus heard this and realized he had done the right thing by not lying about magic. Deciding to feign ignorance, he said it was just a type of magic inherited from his village. Although his story about his village wasn't entirely convincing, he hoped she wouldn't find any flaws in it. The princess announced that she had summoned him to express her gratitude for his timely arrival. Then she started throwing out a series of questions, asking him how he acquired this magic, making Ludus realize he had just put himself in another difficult situation. He had to invent a new story to tell her. He said he had sneaked into a forbidden area in the village where he learned healing magic by reading a magic book. She asked to see the book, but he replied that he had burned it. He thought she would give up, but no, she asked him to teach her that magic. Ludus had to admit that she was truly persistent. Ludus couldn't understand why a royal princess like herself would be interested in learning healing magic. To explain, the princess pulled off her glove, revealing the emperor's mark, identical to the one on Ludus's hand. The royal families of this continent were often granted the king's insignia, allowing them to associate with servants. And without a doubt, the mark that Ludus knew was the five-pointed emperor's mark. The royal family is descended from noble lineages within the empire, which means it's not surprising that they inherit the imperial insignia. However, the princess considered it useless because she didn't know how to use it. In the past, the royal family held a ceremony where they performed pact rituals with selected servants. While her brother easily performed this ritual, she was unable to do so. Since then, she's been ridiculed, and so she has always tried her best to find a solution, studying magic. This five-pointed star allows you to create a pact with monsters, but it's quite ineffective when used against monsters. Those who can use high-level magic are rare. Therefore, she thought that if she could learn Ludus's healing skills, it would greatly benefit the kingdom in many ways. She expressed her dissatisfaction with the current situation. The princess boldly requested that Ludus become her servant, with a salary of 50 del per month. The salary she offered was so low that Ludus could earn that much in a single day. However, no matter how much she offered, Ludus refused to become her servant because he was aware of the dangers of getting involved in the power struggle. In response, Ludus suggested that she should stop using magic if she felt compelled to do so. Being born into the Toil family and becoming a marker was a challenge for her, but she still considers it a gift from the gods. She doesn't dislike the five-pointed star symbol because it reminds her of Emperor Hala Ludus, and the only thing she wished for was to become a great person like him. Ludus listened and burst out laughing. This made the princess feel a little embarrassed. He didn't want to become her servant, but he agreed to be her tutor until she learned the magic skill, for a salary of 2 del per day. Hearing this, the princess's face lit up with a smile, her expression full of excitement. After hearing what she said, Ludus saw her as a person of strong will and didn't think she would do anything bad with magic. The 2 del per day wage he proposed wasn't very high, just enough to support his servants. When Ludus returned home that day, Marina approached her and said that she wanted to become an adventurer. Ludus was taken aback by Marina's sudden decision. She explained that she wanted to be able to help him, just like Rune had done. However, Ludus didn't think she was ready. He believed she would only cause trouble instead of helping. Because she lacked interpersonal skills and basic understanding, Ludus worried that Marina would make a big mistake, but perhaps he'd been a little too harsh. So he decided to invite Marina to join him in gathering herbs. She would have the opportunity to face monsters and prove her abilities as an adventurer. Marina was incredibly excited, but Rune wasn't happy about it at all. Soon after, they set out and encountered a type of herb used to make an antidote. However, this herb had several similar plants that could be poisonous. Small-leaved plants are used as medicinal herbs, while plants with large leaves are poisonous. Ludus challenged Marina by asking her questions about it, but she couldn't answer, which dampened her confidence. Rune suggested Marina should go home, but Ludus felt she needed to experience more things to gain more knowledge. He believes that failure is part of the learning process, and the most important thing is to have the courage to face the challenge. At that moment, Marina was suspended in midair by a trap plant called Rafflesia. However, surprisingly, she burst out laughing instead of being scared. Rune quickly used a fireball to burn the vines. But be careful to save the nectar of the plant because it is highly valuable. Then Rune scolded Marina for putting herself in danger, but Ludus told her not to worry because he had also made a mistake. He glanced over and discovered some magical ore. It can be sold at a fairly high price. Ludus patted Marina on the head, saying it was all thanks to her mistake. They only recently discovered this, and although it was just an accident, she is still being recognized for her unexpected contribution. Rune, despite feeling annoyed with Marina, reminded her not to cause any more trouble and to memorize her magic before returning. On the way home, Ludus offered to teach Marina some fighting techniques to shorten the learning process. Rune heard this and started to feel jealous, so she asked him whether he liked Marina or her. Ludus, taken aback by the question, didn't reply, only feeling her face flush. Then Rune turned away, a slightly displeased expression on his face, but Ludus noticed that Rune was in a good mood. Although he wouldn't dare say that all his decisions were right, if they were wrong, he would just have to live with them. One day, a soldier was seen traveling along the coast in a horse-drawn carriage. However, he encountered a giant, snarling, bloodthirsty wolf that craved human flesh. A few days later, at the Explorers Guild, a rumor spread about a nimble creature that attacked humans in the middle of the night. No one had ever seen the creature, only a dark silhouette with glowing red eyes. Meanwhile, Ludus noticed that Noor's mood had improved compared to before. Despite the widespread rumors, other explorers dismissed the story as unbelievable, given the lack of serious damage or loss. This rumor is spreading among merchants, causing the number of goods from Hoi and Fairway to gradually decrease. The feudal lord offered a reward of 500 del for this shadowy figure, leaving Ludus speechless. Hoping to earn some quick money, he decided to take on this mission with Eris's team. They needed more accommodation for the servants, including food and supplies. Therefore, to solve the housing problem, the team decided to take on this assignment. However, a few hours later, Rune sat with Ludus, drunk and upset that they didn't qualify for the mission. It seems only explorers ranked gold or higher are allowed to take on missions, while Ludus and Rune are still only bronze. Limiting large rewards to those with higher ranks makes sense, because high rewards often come with greater risks. The target may have used invisibility to conceal its true form, meaning it likely possesses intermediate-level magic abilities. However, Noor's group consisted entirely of top-tier explorers, so Ludus believed they would be fine. Nevertheless, he remained concerned about the creature's true purpose. If the goal was to prevent merchants from entering the city, then everything would be clearer. But for now, what the creature is looking for remains a mystery. Ludus suspected it was probably just trying to lure them into some kind of trap. It was time to begin the mission, so Ludus told Marina to gather all the servants. He wasn't aiming for a reward, but simply wanted to gain an overall understanding of the situation. Meanwhile, after hours of searching, Eris's team found nothing unusual. Ludus noticed this and considered expanding the search area, assuming the creature they were looking for was probably no longer near the Alpinaria region. As he followed the path north, Ludus sensed a strange presence. He told himself he was no longer alone and ordered the creature to reveal itself, saying that there were no other humans around. At that moment, a giant black wolf, who identified himself as Aval, appeared and said that it had been a long time since they had last met. Aval explained that he came here because of Rune, but was disappointed to see her living among humans. Rune tells Aval that the emperor he once knew has been reborn in Ludus's body. Initially, Aval was skeptical, but Ludus showed him the emperor's mark on his palm to prove Rune's words were true. Ludus also confessed that he abandoned Aval 1,000 years ago and apologized for his actions, explaining that he only did so because he believed it was the best option at the time. He didn't ask for Aval's forgiveness. I only wish that he can find happiness. However, Aval unexpectedly launched an attack on Ludus's group, completely convinced that his master had been killed by humans. Fortunately, Rune managed to use a magical barrier in time to block the attack. However, Aval continued to attack Ludus, but he nimbly dodged and maintained a slight smile on his face. It was as if he were recalling the moment he first met Avel. Just before Avel was about to deliver the finishing blow, Ludus suddenly ran up and hugged him tightly, saying that he was so glad to see him still alive. This moment made Aval realize that Ludus was truly his master, and he accepted to return as his subordinate, affirming that it was a great honor. However, Rune couldn't accept this, believing Aval should be the one apologizing for his rude behavior. Ludus gently told her to calm down and consider it a simple welcome. Aval immediately mocked her, saying that he had no intention of replacing her as Ludus's maid. This made Rune blush with embarrassment. At this point, Aval mentioned emigration, which piqued Ludus's curiosity. When questioned, Aval explained that humans had recently begun settling in his area, so he had planned to find a new place to live in order to protect his people. However, unable to control his emotions, Avel apologized to Ludus for attacking him earlier. Rune remarked that Ludus had amassed a large following in a short period of time, to the point that his room had become cramped. Aval agreed and said that he knew of some ideal locations where Ludus could prepare new accommodations for his ever-growing number of subordinates. Additionally, Aval revealed that Vandal, an orc, had died of old age, and he had attended his funeral. As for Arlong, Aval last saw him 500 years ago, but he could very well still be alive because he's a vampire. Aval explained that orcs only live slightly longer than humans, which saddened Ludus because he wouldn't have the chance to reunite with all his subordinates from his previous life. Aval then mentions Gilas, a giant ogre who once served Ludus. Currently, Gilas is in possession of Ludus's sword, so Aval suggests that Ludus should prioritize searching for Gilas. Lately, everything seems to be falling into chaos. Both humans and monsters are behaving strangely, as if caught in an invisible storm. Aval had thought their world would be peaceful for the next 20 to 30 years, but things unexpectedly accelerated, beyond all expectations. Ludus felt uneasy and suggested that everyone should be more careful. In the past, when he was emperor, he possessed a special sword. To forge magical weapons, one needs magic cores, crystals containing magical energy. However, magic cores only store a small amount of magical energy, so to create weapons with great power, a stronger energy source is needed. At that time, Ludus used a spell to imbue his sword with magical attributes. The result was a lightweight sword that possessed abundant magical power. With this sword, Ludus's magical power would be significantly increased, but he doesn't need it yet. However, upon reflection, he realized there was something unusual about the goblin invasion. Despite having a chance of winning, their attack on a human city and the resulting heavy losses seemed illogical. If the situation is truly serious, Ludus needs to find his sword again. The next day, Ludus arrived at the palace. The princess looked at him with a serious expression and declared that she wanted to find the Holy Emperor's sword. The princess's original reason for coming to Elpin was to find that sword. Ludus's lost sword, which is now in Gilas's possession. Ludus pretended not to know much about it and asked the princess if the sword was famous. The princess explained that, according to legend, Emperor Saint Ludus was a master swordsman. His sword is said to possess incredible historical value. This statement shocked Ludus deeply, as he was by no means a skilled swordsman. He asked again if she meant that he had once been a skilled sorcerer. The princess explained that, yes, Ludus they knew was an excellent sorcerer, but he was also widely known as a renowned swordsman. This was incredibly hard for Ludus to believe, because although he had taken some basic swordsmanship lessons, his skills were terrible. Hearing about such a far-fetched legend made him feel ridiculous. According to legend, he annihilated tens of thousands of people and monsters, both as emperor and as the strongest swordsman in the entire empire. Ludus covered her head with her hands, disgusted by the exaggerated myths about her. The princess's interest wasn't just in the sword itself, but primarily in the immense magical power it contained. Possessing this sword would allow her to unleash powerful, high-level spells. Ludus recalled that he had taught her many different types of magic, and she was a very quick learner. If she had enough magical power, she could certainly handle advanced spells. Ludus noticed that the princess seemed tired. He understood that she had tried very hard, but no matter how hard she tried, her magical power couldn't increase easily. Wanting to test her belief, he asked if she truly believed that the emperor's sword lay somewhere in Elpin, or if it was all just a legend. The princess, after reading so many biographies about the emperor, firmly asserted that she was 100% convinced the sword was not a myth. To expedite the search, she enlisted the help of adventurers by leaving a request at the Adventurers Guild. She promised that whoever found the sword would receive a reward of 30 del. However, the adventurers at the guild felt the reward was too low, making them uninterested in taking on the mission. They also found it absurd that the princess made a request based on a fairy tale about the Holy Emperor at Harrison Castle. Doubt still hangs over whether the 1,000-year-old sword still exists. Among the few who believed in the sword's existence, Ludus was one, and perhaps Eris was the only one else who shared that belief. Surprisingly, Noor turned out to be a loyal follower of Emperor Ludus. She revealed that her village possessed an ancient record mentioning a servant of the emperor who had hidden the sword while fleeing the empire. The history of the founding of the Westburg nation also contained similar documentation, based on administrative records, further reinforcing the accuracy of the Holy Emperor's biography. Although the sword was made of iron, it had been magically enhanced, making it immune to environmental influences. This confirms that the sword may indeed be located somewhere in Elpin. However, most others were skeptical of Noor's theory. The 30 del reward was too low for them to be interested in, and even Harrison Castle decided to ignore it. However, Ludus was tasked with finding the sword, accompanying Rune. He did this not only to verify the truth, but also because he wanted to see Gilas, his once loyal servant, to find out if he was still alive. Gilas was a member of the nearly immortal Cyclops clan, so Ludus believed he was still alive, even after a millennium had passed. However, Rune anxiously asked Ludus if they should change their clothes before meeting Gilas. "I'm afraid things will end in another battle like the one with Awful." Ludus reassured her, saying that even if Gilas were to get angry like Awful had, he is unlikely to resort to force under any circumstances. Ludus's memories returned to his time as a student at the Academy of Magic. One day, he and his classmates encountered Helos, a fearsome cyclops, and decided to attack him to drive him away. But surprisingly, Gilus didn't resist or show any aggression. Instead, he pulled out some rabbits and said he wanted to be friends. Gilos's nature was so gentle that he would never kill even an insect. His only food was fruit, despite being a giant cyclops. For this reason, Ludus gave his sword to Gilus, believing that he would never use it to cause violence. Even after Ludus recounted this story, Rune warned Ludus that she would personally attack Gilus if he showed any rudeness towards Ludus. However, Gilus never intended to harm or kill anyone, and that is why Ludus chose him as her servant. Upon reaching the ruins where Gilus is believed to have lived, the gate was large enough for a cyclops as massive as Gilus to pass through. This place, far from human settlements, is an ideal location to hide Ludus's sword. Although there were no signs of humans around, Ludus decided to use her presence detection skills to ensure her safety. He sensed that someone had been here before, and also discovered a strange magical power, similar to Nor's. This made him wonder if she had been here before him. Nor knew a great deal about the Emperor, but Ludus doubted she would know about this place. Anyway, he didn't want them to find out, so he asked Rune to use his invisibility and camouflage skills. Rune hugged him from behind, saying that the disguise would be much easier when she was close to him. Later, they discovered footprints, which made Ludus realize that Nor must have formed a group with others, since Castle Arison had not accepted such requests before. They came across a huge rock, and Ludus thought this might be Nor's work.